Good day, everyone. I am Kyle Angelica from the Bachelor of Secondary Education, major in Sciences. And today, we will be discussing a new topic which is entitled The Cellular Respiration in Obtaining Energy from Food. But before we will moving on through our further discussions for today, let's have first our learning objectives. So, here's our learning objectives. At the end of this topic, you will be able to describe the process of cell respiration. Second, relate the structure of mitochondria to its function in cell respiration. Third, explain how organisms use the energy from cell respiration. And fourth, contrast the processes of cell respiration and photosynthesis. And lastly, explain the process of fermentation. So, here's our table of contents. So the first topic that we will going to discuss is all about the energy flow and chemical cycling in the biosphere. Second, the cellular respiration in aerobic harvest of food energy. And lastly, the fermentation in which an aerobic harvest of food energy. Serious athletes train extensively to reach the peak of their physical potential. A key aspect of athletic conditioning involves increasing aerobic capacity, the ability of the heart and the lungs to deliver oxygen to the body cells. For many endurance athletes, such as long distance runners or cyclists, the rate at which oxygen is provided to working muscles is the limiting factor in their performance. So, why is oxygen is so important? Whether you are exercising or just going about your daily task, your muscles needs a continuous supply of energy to perform work. Muscle cells obtain this energy from the sugar glucose through a series of chemical reactions that depend upon a constant input of oxygen. Therefore, to keep moving, your body needs a steady supply of oxygen. So, when there is enough oxygen reaching your cells to support the energy needs, metabolism is said to be aerobic. As your muscles work harder, you breathe faster and more deeply to inhale oxygen. If you continue to pick up the pace, you will approach your aerobic capacity, the maximum rate of which oxygen can be taken in and used by your muscle cells, and therefore the most strenuous exercise that your body can maintain aerobically. Exercise scientists can use oxygen monitoring equipment to precisely determine the maximum possible aerobic output for any given person. Such data it allow a well-trained athlete to stay within aerobic limits in which it ensuring the maximum possible output, in other words, his or her best effort. So, every living organism depends on processes that provides energy. In fact, we need energy to walk, talk, and think. In short, to stay alive. The human body has trillions of cells, all hard at work, all demanding fuel continuously, and in this chapter, you'll learn how cells harvest food energy and put it to work with the help of oxygen. Along the way, we'll consider the implications of how the body responds to exercise. So that's it. So the first subtopic that we will going to discuss is all about the energy flow and chemical cycling in the biosphere. So, all life requires energy. In almost all ecosystems on Earth, this energy originates with the sun. So, during photosynthesis, the energy of sunlight is converted to the chemical energy of sugars and other organic molecules. Photosynthesis takes place in the chloroplast of plant and algae as well as in some prokaryotes. All animals depend on this conversion for food and more. You're probably wearing clothing made of a product of photosynthesis in which it is called cotton. Most of our homes are framed with lumber, in which it is wood produced by photosynthetic trees, and even textbooks rather are printed on material in which it is called paper, in which it can be traced to photosynthesis in plants. But from an animal's point of view, photosynthesis is primarily about providing food. So we have here the producers, in which plants and other autotrophs, are also known as self-feeders, or organisms that make all their own organic matter including carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids from nutrients that are entirely inorganic, carbon dioxide from the air, and water and minerals from the soil. In other words, autotrophs make their own food if they don't need to eat to gain energy to power their cellular processes. In contrast, humans and other animals are heterotrophs, or also known as other feeders, organisms that cannot make organic molecules from inorganic ones. Therefore, we must eat organic material to get our nutrients and provide energy for life's processes. So most ecosystems depend entirely on photosynthesis for food. For this reason, biologists refer to plants and other autotrophs as producers, and heterotrophs in contrast are consumers because they obtain their food by eating plants, by eating animals, or have that eaten plants. So we animals and other heterotrophs depend on autotrophs for organic fuel and for the raw organic materials that we need to build our cells and tissues. So here's an example of showing a producer and consumer. It is a koala, in which a koala is the consumer eating leaves and that produced by a photosynthetic plant, in which the producer is the plant. So, within a plant, the chemical ingredients for photosynthesis are carbon dioxide, a gas that passes from the air into a plant through tiny pores, and water absorbed from the soil by the plant's roots, and inside the leaf cells, organelles called chloroplasts use light energy to rearrange the atoms of these ingredients to produce sugars, most importantly the glucose, and other organic molecules. That you can think of chloroplasts as tiny solar-powered sugar factories. A byproduct of photosynthesis is oxygen gas that is released through pores into the atmosphere. So it is called a chemical process of cellular respiration. It uses oxygen to convert the energy stored in the chemical bonds of sugars to other source of chemical energy that is called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. So cells expend ATP for almost all their work. In both plants and animals, the production of ATP during cellular respiration mainly in the organelles called the mitochondria. So when we say mitochondria, in both plants and animals, the production of ATP during cellular respiration occurs mainly in organelles called mitochondria. So, you might notice in figure 6.2 that the energy takes place a one-way trip through an ecosystem, entering as sunlight and exiting as heat. Chemicals, in contrast, are recycled. Notice also in figure 6.2 that the waste product of cellular respiration are CO2 and H2O, the same ingredients used in inputs for photosynthesis. Plants store chemical energy through photosynthesis and then harvest this energy through cellular respiration. Note that plants perform both photosynthesis to produce fuel molecules and cellular respiration to burn them, while animals perform only cellular respiration. Plants usually make more organic molecules than they need for fuel. This photosynthesis surplus provides material for the plant to grow or can be stored, such as starch in potatoes, and thus, when you consume a carrot, potato, or turnip, you are eating the energy reservoir that plants if not harvested. So it would have used to grow the following spring. So people have always taken advantage of plants' photosynthetic abilities by eating them. More recently, engineers have managed to tap into this energy reserve to produce liquid biofuels, primarily ethanol. But no matter at the end of the product, you can trace the energy in raw materials for growth and back to solar powered photosynthesis. So it is showed in figure 6.2, and energy flows through an ecosystem, entering as sunlight and exiting as heat. In contrast, chemical elements are recycled within the ecosystem. So the next topic that we will going to discuss is all about the cellular respiration or the aerobic harvest of the food energy. So, we usually use the word respiration to mean everything. Although respiration on the organism level should not be confused with cellular respiration. So the two processes are closely related. Cellular processes respiration requires a cell to exchange two gases with its surroundings. The cell takes in oxygen in the form of gas, and it gets rid of waste in the form of the gas carbon dioxide or CO2. Respiration or breathing results in the exchange of these same gases between your blood and the outside air. Oxygen present in the air you inhale diffuses across the lining of your lungs and into your bloodstream, and the CO2 in your bloodstream diffuses into your lungs and exits your body when you exhale. Every molecule of CO2 that you exhale was originally formed in one of the mitochondria of your body cells. Internal combustion engines, like the ones found in cars, use oxygen through the air intakes to break down the gasoline, and a cell also requires to break down its fuel, and cellular respiration, as a biological version of internal combustion, is the main way that chemical energy is harvested from food and converted to ATP energy. Therefore, cellular respiration is an aerobic process in which it is just another way of saying that it requires energy. Putting all this together, we can now define cellular respiration as the aerobic harvesting of chemical energy from organic fuel molecules. So, again, as you can see in figure 6.2 on how breathing is related to respiration, it is when you inhale, you breathe in oxygen, the oxygen delivered to your cells, and where it used in cellular respiration rather, and carbon dioxide, a waste of product of cellular respiration, in which it diffuses from your cells to your blood and travels to your lungs, where it is exhaled. So, all living organisms depend on transformations of energy and matter. So, we see examples of such transformations throughout the study of life, but few are important as their conversion of energy in fuels such as food molecules to form a cells that can use directly. Most often, the fuel molecule used by cells is glucose or simply a sugar with a formula of C6H12O6. So as you can see, this equation summarizes the transformation of glucose during cellular respiration. So as you can see, the equation, the series of arrows in this formula represents the fact that cellular respiration consists of many chemical steps, as specific enzymes catalyze each reaction in the pathway, more than 2 dozen reactions in all. In fact, these reactions constitute one of the most important metabolic pathways for nearly every eukaryotic cell, that are those found in plants, fungi, protists, and animals. This path provides the energy these cells need to maintain in the functions of life. So, that's it. So, the many chemical reactions that make up a cellular respiration can be grouped into three main stages. So these are the glycolysis, or the glycolysis. The second one is the citric acid cycle, and the last one is the electron transport. So as you can see in figure 6.4, in which shows a roadmap for cellular respiration, it is a roadmap that will help you to follow the three stages of respiration and see where stage occurs in your cells. So, now that you have a big picture view of cellular respiration, let's examine the process in more detail. So, the first stage that we will going to discuss is the glycolysis or the glycolysis. So, the word glycolysis means splitting of sugar. And that's just what happens during glycolysis. A 6-carbon glucose molecule is broken in half, forming 2 or 3 carbon molecules. So during glycolysis, a molecule of glucose is split into 2 molecules of a compound called the pyruvic acid. The enzymes for glycolysis are located in the cytoplasm. So as you can see that the 3 carbon molecules then donate high energy electrons to the NAD+, forming the NADH. So in addition to NADH, DH, glycolysis, also banks for ATP molecules directly when enzymes transfer phosphate from groups from fuel molecules to ADP. Glycolysis thus produces a profit of 2 molecules of ATP per molecule of glucose. So, what remains of the fractured glucose at the end of the glycolysis are 2 molecules of the pyruvic acid. So, the pyruvic acid still holds most of the energy of glucose, and that energy is harvested in the second stage of cellular respiration, in which we call the citric acid cycle. So as you can see, this is the process of how glycolysis is work. So in glycolysis, a team of enzymes split glucose, eventually forming 2 molecules of pyruvic acid. After investing the 2 adenosine triphosphate at the start, glycolysis generates 4 adenosine triphosphate directly. So more energy will be arrested later from high energy electrons used to form NADH from the 2 molecules of pyruvic acid. So, as you can see in figure 6.6, it is the link between glycolysis and the citric acid cycle, in which the conversion of the pyruvic acid to acetyl CoA. So remember that one of the molecule of glucose is split into 2 molecules of pyruvic acid. Therefore, the process shown here occurs twice for each starting glucose molecule. So as you can see, the next stage that we will going to discuss is all about the citric acid cycle, or also called as Krebs cycle. So it completes the breakdown of glucose all the way to carbon dioxide, in which it is then released as waste product. So the enzymes for the citric acid cycle are dissolved in the fluid within mitochondria. So during glycolysis, 1 molecule of glucose is split into 2 molecules of pyruvic acid, but before pyruvic acid can be used by this citric acid cycle, it must be or groomed, in which means it converted to a form to form the citric acid cycle that can use. So first, each pyruvic acid loses a carbon as carbon dioxide. So this is the first of this waste product we've seen so far in the breakdown of glucose. So the remaining fuel molecules, each with only 2 carbons left, are called the acetic acid, or the acid that's in vinegar. So second, electrons are stripped from these molecules and transferred to another molecule of NAD+, forming more NADH, and finally each acetic acid is attached to a molecule called the coenzyme, or coenzyme A, and an enzyme derived from the B vitamin pantothenic acid to form acetyl coenzyme. So the coenzyme escorts the acetic acid into the first reaction of the citric acid cycle, in which the coenzyme A is then stripped and recycled. So the citric acid cycle finishes extracting the energy of the sugar of dismantling the acetic and acid molecules all the way down to carbon dioxide. So as you can see, it is a process of how the citric acid cycle works. So here, the acetic acid joins as a 4-carbon acceptor molecule to form a 6-carbon product called the citric acid, for which the cycle is named. So for every acetic acid molecule that enters the cycle as fuel, then the second 2 carbon dioxide molecules eventually exit as a waste product. Along the way, the citric acid cycle harvests energy from the fuel. So the third, some of the energy is used to produce adenosine triphosphate directly. However, the cycle captures much more energy in the form of NADH. And lastly, the fifth one is the second closely related electron carrier called the FADH2. So all the carbon atoms that entered the cycle as fuel are accounted for the carbon dioxide exhaust, and the 4-carbon acceptor molecule is recycled. So we have tracked only acetic acid molecule through the citric acid cycle here, but because glycolysis splits glucose in two, the citric acid cycle occurs twice for each glucose molecule that fuels a cell. So, the next stage that we will going to discuss is all about the electron transport. So, during the cellular respiration, the electrons gathered from the food molecules gradually fall, losing energy at each step. So, in this way, cellular respiration unlocks chemical energy in small amounts and a bit by bit that cells can put to productive use. So, electrons are transferred from glucose in food molecules in NAD plus, in which this electron transfer converts NAD plus to NADH. Then NADH releases two electrons that enter an electron transport chain. So a series of electron carrier molecules. So this chain is like a bucket brigade. So with each molecule passing an electron to the next molecule with each exchange. So the electron gives up the bit of energy, and this downward cascade releases energy from the electrons uses to make ATP or adenosine triphosphate. So let's take a closer look at the path that electrons take in figure 6.9, in which each link in an electron transport chains is a molecule. So usually protein, so it's shown as purple circles in the figure 6.9. So in a series of reactions, each member of a chain transfers a in a series of reactions, each member of the chain transfers electrons. So with each transfer, the electrons give up a small amount of energy that can be used indirectly to generate adenosine triphosphate, and the first molecule of the chain accepts electrons from NADH. Thus, NADH carries electrons from glucose and other fuel molecules and deposit them at the top of the electrons transport chain. So the molecule at the bottom of the chain finally drops. So the electrons to oxygen. At the same time, oxygen picks up hydrogen, forming water. So as you can see also in cellular respiration, by illustrating the using the hard hat analogy, it is the splitting of the bonds of a molecule of glucose provides the energy that boosts an electron from a low energy state of high energy state. Then, the overall effect of all this transfer of electrons during cellular respiration is a downward trip for electrons from glucose to NADH plus to an electron transport to chain to oxygen. So, during the stepwise release of chemical energy in the electron transport chain, our cells makes the most of their adenosine triphosphate. So, it is actually oxygen that the electron grabber at the end that makes it all possible. So, by pulling electrons down the transport chain from fuel molecules, oxygen functions somewhat like gravity pulling objects downhill. So because oxygen rather is the final electron acceptor, so we cannot survive more than a few minutes without breathing. So viewed this way, drowning is deadly because it deprives cells of final electron grabbers, in which oxygen is needed to drive cellular respiration. So as you can see, it is how the electron transport drives ATP synthase machines. So this is one. So as you can see in 6.10, it is show simplified view of how the energy previously stored in NADH and FADH2 then can now be used to generate adenosine triphosphate. So NADH and FADH2 transfer electrons to an electron transport chain. Then the electron transport chain uses the energy supply to pump H plus across the inner mitochondrial membrane. Then oxygen pulls electrons down the transport chain. Then the H plus concentrated on the one side of the membrane rushes back downhill through an ATP synthase. So this action spins a component of ATP synthase, just as water turns the turbines in a dam. So the rotation activates part of the synthase molecule that attach phosphate groups to ADP molecules to regenerate the ATP. So the poison's cyanide produces its deadly effect by binding to one of the protein complexes in the electron transport chain that mark with a skull and crossbones symbol in figure 6.10. So when bound there, cyanide blocks the passage of electrons to oxygen, then this blockage is like clogging outflow channel of a dam. So as a result, no H plus radiant rather is generated and no ATP or adenosine triphosphate is made. So cells stop working and the organism dies. So here's the results of the cellular respiration. So when taking cellular respiration apart to see how all the molecular nuts and bolts of its metabolic machinery work, so it's easy to lose sight of its overall function in order to generate about 32 molecules of adenosine triphosphate per molecules of glucose, in which the actual number that can vary by a few depending on an organism's and molecules involved. So by looking at the summary of ATP yields during cellular respiration, it will help you to keep track of adenosine triphosphate molecules generated. As we discussed, glycolysis and the citric acid cycle each contribute to adenosine triphosphate by directly making it, and the rest of the ATP molecules are produced by ATP synthase powered by fall electrons from food to oxygen. So the electrons are carried from the other fuel to electrons transport chains by NADH and FADH2 Each electron pairs drop down a transport chain from NADH or FADH2 can power the synthesis of a few ATP. So you can visualize the process like this. Energy flows from glucose to carrier molecules, ultimately to ATP. So we have seen that glucose can provide energy to make the ATP our cells use for all their work. So all of the energy consuming activities of your body, moving your muscles and maintaining your heartbeat and temperature, and even thinking that goes on within your brain can be traced back ATP. And before that, the glucose that was used to make it. Is the importance of glucose is to underscore the severity of disease in which glucose balance is disturbed. So as you can also see in the figure 6.12, the energy from food. So the monomers from carbohydrates are called the polysaccharides, and sugars like fats and proteins can also serve as fuel for cellular respiration. So the figure 6.12 diagrams some metabolic routes for the use of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins as fuel for respiration. Then by taking together, all of these food molecules make up of your calorie burning metabolism. So the interplay between these pathways provides a clear example of a theme of system interactions. In this case, all of these interactions contribute to maintaining balance or in maintaining a balanced metabolism. So the next subtopic that we will going to discuss is all about the fermentation and aerobic harvest of food energy. So you know You know by now that as your muscles work, they require a constant supply of ATP or adenosine triphosphate, so which is generated by cellular respiration. As long as your blood provides your muscle cells with enough oxygen to keep electrons falling down transport chains into mitochondria, your muscle will work aerobically. So, from the word fermentation, let's unlock first the word fermentation, in which it is a natural process through which microorganisms like yeast and bacteria convert carbs such as starch, sugar into alcohol or acids. So when we say fermentation, it preserves food. It also enriches the palette of flavors. It also allows a better assimilation of food. It also helps in digestion. And lastly, it can enrich intestines with living microorganisms. So fermentation in human muscle cells. So to harvest. So when muscle cells consume ATP faster than oxygen that can be supplied for cellular respiration, rather, the conditions become anaerobic, and muscle cells will begin to regenerate adenosine triphosphate by fermentation. So the waste product under these anaerobic conditions is lactic acid. The ATP yield per glucose is much lower during fermentation than during cellular respiration. So the ATP yield per glucose is much lower during fermentation is 2 consists of 2 ATP, while during the cellular respiration it consists about 32 ATP. So, as you can see in figure 6.13, fermentation producing lactic acid. So glycolysis produces adenosine triphosphate even in the absence of oxygen. So this process requires a continuous supply of NAD plus to accept electrons from glucose, and the NAD plus is regenerated when NADH transfers the electrons and it removed from the food of pyruvic acid, thereby producing lactic acid or other waste products depending on the species of organisms. So, going back to the next topic, which is all about the fermentation in microorganisms. So the yeast and some other organisms can survive without oxygen waste from fermentation. So it can be ethyl alcohol, lactic acid, or other compounds depending on the species. So our muscles cannot rely on lactic acid fermentation for very long. However, the two ATP molecules produced per glucose molecule during fermentation are enough to sustain many microorganisms. So we have domesticated such as microbes to transform milk into cheese, sour cream, and yogurt. These foods owe their sharp or sour flavor mainly to lactic acid. So the food industry also uses fermentation to produce soy sauce from soybeans, to pickle cucumbers, olives, and cabbage, and to produce meat product like sausage, pepperoni, and salami. So this yeast, a microscopic fungus, is capable of both cellular respiration and fermentation. So when kept in an aerobic environment, yeast cells ferment sugar and other food to stay alive. So as they do, the yeast produce ethyl alcohol as a waste product instead of lactic acid. So as you can see in figure 6.18, 15 rather, it is a fermentation producing ethyl alcohol in which the alcohol produced by yeast as a bread rises is burned off during the baking. So this alcoholic fermentation also releases carbon dioxide. For thousands of years, people have put yeast work producing alcoholic beverages such as a beer and wine using airtight barrels and vats. So where lack of oxygen rather forces the yeast ferment glucose into ethanol. And as Very Baker knows, the carbon dioxide bubbles from fermenting yeast also can cause bread dough to rise. So the alcohol produced in fermenting bread is burned off during baking. So I guess that's all for our topic for today. So I hope you've learned so many things about my topic for today. So that's all. Thank you and God bless. Once again, I am Angelica, your reporter for today. See you on the next video.